In the small town of St. Martin's, Missouri, when a 9-year-old girl vanishes, an entire community comes together to search for her. While investigators combed through the vast woods where it was believed she was last seen, they discovered 2 small graves. The disturbing words found inside a teenager's diary would lead homicide detectives to a shocking and very unusual suspect. Who was this innocent young victim, and what kind of monster had lured her into the woods to die? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss tales of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. This is a special warning for anyone who may be extra sensitive to crimes against children. This episode is a tough one, and listener discretion is strongly advised. On the evening of October 21st, 2009, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten never returned home. When the little girl failed to show up for dinner as she had promised after going out to play with her friend, her mother knew something was terribly wrong. Elizabeth always made sure to be home before dark because she was terrified of the night, especially the woods, which was right near her residence. She called the police at 7 p.m. to report her child missing. Elizabeth had her cell phone on her, but she was not answering. Law enforcement contacted the cell phone carrier and requested an emergency ping, which collects the signals generated from the phone by the nearest cell tower. All of the pings were centered around the area of the woods. Law enforcement officers and hundreds of volunteers scoured every inch of the dense forest land near the house. They promptly set up checkpoints for anyone driving to or from the area. Planes and helicopters searched the immense woods. They launched dog rescue and recovery teams. Divers searched the ponds and nearby rivers, but neither the little girl nor her phone was found. They launched dog rescue and recovery teams. Divers searched the ponds and nearby rivers, but neither the little girl nor her phone was found. Every local registered sex offender was tracked down and interviewed, but no one was a suspect in this innocent child's disappearance. Law enforcement was lost on who could have taken little Elizabeth and why. Then Detective Rice remembered the last person who was seen with her, her 6-year-old friend, Emma Bustamante. When interviewed by the FBI, 6-year-old Emma told them that she was playing with her, and about an hour later, Elizabeth walked home. Then Emma was outside playing, and she got stuck in some thorn bushes. This is when she began to scream and cry out for her older sister Alyssa to come help her. The following day, officers interviewed everyone in the neighborhood, but one of the kids wasn't around. 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, whose sister Emma was the last one to have been seen with Elizabeth before she went missing. The 2 girls had been playing together that day. Emma had arrived unexpectedly at their house around 5 p.m., asking to see if Elizabeth could come outside and play. Her mother told the police that Elizabeth had been practicing her lines and singing songs for a play. She was just about to make dinner when the doorbell rang, and it was their neighbor Emma. She didn't really want her daughter to go, but both girls were jumping up and down, all excited to go hang out together, so she let her go, but insisted that she be home for dinner by 6. Then Anthony, one of Elizabeth's brothers, told his mom that when he was playing with Alyssa's twin brothers that day, he heard Alyssa say to Emma, "Don't tell anyone." When investigators called the high school, they were informed that Alyssa Bustamante was not at school that day. Officers realized they had to find the teenager. When officers first talked to Alyssa Bustamante, she was honest with them and admitted that she had skipped school that day. She swore, though, that she had no idea what happened to Elizabeth. The girl was calm, open, and seemed to be honest, so they didn't give her much more thought. At the time, Mark Richardson, prosecuting attorney of Cole County, Missouri, stated that she was not and should not be considered a suspect. Then, as local volunteers began exploring the woods behind Bustamante's residence, they came across something very bizarre. To them, it looked like an open grave. Detectives were called in to process the scene, the hole, for anything that may lead them to Elizabeth, but they couldn't find her or her phone. Around 3 or 4 p.m. that same day, investigators arrived at Alyssa Bustamante's residence, which was her grandparents' home. They were welcomed in by her grandmother, Karen Brooke, who gave them consent to search the house, including Alyssa's room. Officers found shovels in the garage that had fresh mud on them. They also located muddy jeans and clothing that appeared to have droplets of dried blood. The items were tested, and the blood was later identified as belonging to 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante. Agent Tricia Gentry of the FBI evidence team opened Alyssa's bedroom. The room was a bit unsettling. Alyssa was known to be gothic and a little punk, so they expected as much from her decor, but what was on the wall was much darker than just some typical moody teen's room. There were drawings, notes stuck to the wall, and handwritten words, some of which appeared to have been written in blood. There was also a poem about cutting, which is the form of self-injury using a blade or a knife. On the opposite wall was a sketch of a person. There were slashings made across the head and the arm. The picture was titled Emma. Cards and letters from a state correctional institute were also taped to the wall. They were from her father. Then Agent Gentry found Alyssa's diary, hidden underneath a blanket. There were some writings of concern, but when she came across the last entry, she was silenced by the words she saw. It was dated October 21st, 2009, and was mainly crossed over in blue ink. However, 3 words were still legible: throat, slit, and killed. Then at the end of the entry was a sentence that was partially untouched. It said, "Now I've got to go to church, LOL." In her hands laid what could be a confession to murder. They brought in Alyssa Bustamante for a formal interview the following morning. Inside the small police room with her was her guardian, Karen Brooke, and juvenile officer Toby Meyer, along with head detective Rice. The video of her then not publicly released interrogation and subsequent confession is chilling on many levels. Over the 2 hours that she is interrogated, Alyssa Bustamante is so calm, composed, and personable, both with the detective and juvenile officer. She talks openly about how she enjoys digging holes to bury dead animals in, and that she dug the 2 graves they found. She weaves in and out of the details of the day without any visible signs of stress, anxiety, or fear. This is when she displays true signs of being a psychopath. Alyssa Bustamante chats up both this seasoned detective and juvenile officer, casually discussing the events of the day. Detective Rice attempts several times to trip her up, but she appears unshaken. That is until he brings up her diary. During the interrogation, the grandmother openly admits to have read parts of this diary he mentions, which Alyssa reacts to in anger, knowing that her privacy was violated. When the detective tells her that they have her diary, and they have read it all, including her most recent entry. Several minutes pass in the video as Alyssa Bustamante and Detective Rice proceed to share what can only be called a stare down with one another. Then the detective tells her, "We know something happened to Elizabeth and you need to let us know. And if it was an accident, then we can deal with that. But we need to know." Alyssa finally breaks, feigning tears, sniffling through her admission that she accidentally killed the little girl. A telltale sign of psychopathy is when an individual emulates emotions based on what they know is expected of them. Alyssa claimed they were messing around and she fell and died and she panicked. But when the detective addresses how an autopsy will be performed and any injuries will be revealed, Alyssa replies yes when he asks her if the girl's throat was cut. Her grandmother lets out a horrifying shriek at hearing this horrendous one word and almost collapses, sliding off her chair. Before continuing, officers lead her grandmother out of the room because she just can't take hearing this anymore. Alyssa Bustamante claims that she came up from behind Elizabeth, cutting her throat, stabbing her twice with the knife. She said that she burned the body and pushed the remains into the creek. She swears that the grave was dug after killing Elizabeth. During the interrogation, Detective Rice keeps inquiring about her protecting someone or whether she had an accomplice in the crime. He first entertains the thought that her boyfriend was involved or at least knew about what she had done. Alyssa fervently denies that anyone other than herself committed the crime, and that no one knew about what she had done. Then Detective Rice keeps prodding her, pushing her, beginning to paint this story of how he knows her grandfather loves her so much and would do anything to help her, implying that he helped move the body and bury Elizabeth. Again, Alyssa states that no one except for her was involved in the murder and concealment of the corpse. According to court documents that were released after her sentencing, her boyfriend was interviewed excessively by the FBI and the State Highway Patrol. Over 7 days, he was talked to 8 different times because officers were convinced that he must know something since she had skipped school that day after murdering Elizabeth and spent it with him at his house. According to her boyfriend, the only thing Alyssa had told him was that Emma's younger friend was missing and that officers had searched her house. He did admit to finding a box cutter or a black knife in Alyssa's backpack, but it was determined that it was not the weapon used in the killing, since it was significantly smaller. A court motion was filed to block the boyfriend from being called to testify at her trial. It was later revealed that he had submitted to a polygraph test, which he failed, but was never charged with any crime. As most of us are aware, polygraphs are notoriously unreliable, and failing it was likely indicative of his nerves. In fact, later when FBI interviewed her boyfriend, he was so shocked and repulsed by the killing that he became violently ill and threw up. During the interrogation video, when the detective inquires as to why Elizabeth was her chosen victim, Alyssa said there was no particular reason why except for her being in close proximity. Then Officer Rice said, "Was it just because you wanted to know how it felt to kill someone?" To which Alyssa answers, "Yeah, I guess." I found this specific part of the interrogation to be highly manipulative. Across almost all media sources, it states that Alyssa Bustamante just wanted to know how it felt to kill someone. But during the interrogation, she never offered up that statement herself. I am not saying that it wasn't the primary reason why she did what she did, but the detective feeding her this statement was further evidence of the lack of integrity exhibited throughout the interrogation. This young killer's confession is chilling on so many levels. According to the offender, the following sequence of events is believed to have occurred on October 21st, 2009. Alyssa had found her target. It had been a good 4 days since she had dug the graves far out into the forest on a day off from school. She had sent her little sister Emma over to her friend Elizabeth's house to invite her out to play. Then, when Elizabeth was heading home, she asked Emma to call her to return. For some unknown reason, even though there was a 2-lane highway that crossed between her and Emma's house, Elizabeth Olten took a shortcut that day through the woods. Alyssa was waiting for her. There she was, little Elizabeth Olten in her pink t-shirt. Alyssa grabbed her hand and told the girl, "I've got something really neat to show you. It's just a little bit further up here." The two girls walked deep into the forest and up a hill. They had walked about a 1/4 mile when Alyssa had her stop in front of the dug hole. She reached out and locked her hands around the young girl's neck, strangling her. Elizabeth could no longer breathe, and as she began to lose consciousness, Alyssa unzipped her backpack and pulled out the knife she had taken from the kitchen. She plunged the large blade deep into the small girl's chest. She pulled it out and stabbed her over and over again, about 6 or 7 times. Then Alyssa slit her throat, watching as the blood pooled around her feet and onto the floor of the woods. Alyssa dragged her by the feet to the spot of the graves. She tossed the child's body into the grave and threw some leaves and dirt on top to conceal it. Alyssa then left the woods and returned home. She had a church dance that night. While getting ready, she wrote in her diary what she had done and how it had made her feel. Her grandmother and guardian, Karen Brooke, later told the court how Alyssa seemed especially happy that night. After Alyssa Bustamante confessed to killing Elizabeth Olten, she led the police to the body. Deep in the woods lay the 2 dug graves. Detectives could see that the child's body was buried under only a few inches of dirt. Her throat and wrists were visibly slashed, and her chest had several stab wounds. The cell phone they had been tracing was tucked inside the girl's pants. Licensed pathologist, physician, and surgeon Chris Stacy described the specific wounds and injuries found on the victim. The autopsy revealed that the official cause of death was by strangulation and sharp force injury. The victim was strangled from anywhere between 30 seconds to 1 minute. In his official report, he noted how the stab wounds were irregular, not precise or controlled. It was as if the victim, or the offender holding the knife, had been moving around. Once detectives began to delve deeper into Alyssa Bustamante's social media presence, they were exposed to the mind of a demented, twisted teenage girl. In some of her pictures on Facebook, her eyes are painted in heavy black kabuki-style makeup, and her lips are smeared with blood-red lipstick. She stares at the camera, gritting her teeth or pouting sexily. Her YouTube account name was Akamakaji, which is Japanese for wolf shadow. On her MySpace page, it lists her hobbies as cutting and killing people. There was a photograph of Alyssa wielding a knife to another girl's throat, and a video with her younger twin brothers, where she is seen encouraging them to touch an electric cattle fence. The girl looks menacingly at the camera and says, "This is where it gets good. This is where my brothers get hurt." Alyssa Bustamante was initially held in juvenile custody, but the calculated depravity of her crimes would soon change this. In November 2009, Cole County juvenile officer requested that juvenile jurisdiction over her be relinquished, and Alyssa be transferred to the state for criminal prosecution. At the hearing for Alyssa Bustamante to be transferred to adult court, evidence against her was presented. It was determined, and I quote, "The nature of the crime charged was serious, vicious, violent, and forceful, and resulted in the death of a 9-year-old child, and therefore the juvenile court gave up jurisdiction over her crimes. Her trial date was set for January 26, 2012. The age in which a juvenile can be transferred to adult or criminal court varies from state to state. In Missouri, an individual has to be 12 years old at the time of the offense to be prosecuted for murder. Alyssa Bustamante was charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action, the latter charge having resulted from her use of a knife to slit her victim's throat and stab her after she had been strangled and lost consciousness. The police interrogation video portraying her confession would be successfully suppressed by the defense. It was first noted in the order to declare the recording inadmissible because she was a juvenile held in a custodial setting prior to being formally arrested. At the time of the interrogation and her confession, she was in juvenile custody, so anything she said to the juvenile officer was found to be inadmissible in a criminal court. Her statements, however, made to Detective Rice may have been admissible in adult court if it weren't for the blatant interference and unethical active participation shown by the juvenile officer, Toby Meyer. She was supposed to be there as her advocate, but instead she misled and deceived Alyssa Bustamante into confessing to the crime. Her behavior indicated that she was someone on her side. She is seen and heard continuously encouraging and coaxing Alyssa to tell the truth under the guise that she is there in her best interest. Her statutory role was limited to observation and to uphold the juvenile's rights not to participate in the interrogation. Once Alyssa Bustamante was taken into custody, her darkness began to seep out once more. She attempted to cut herself with her own fingernails. As she became increasingly more severely depressed and anxious while sitting in jail, she was placed on suicide watch. Her appointed juvenile defense attorney, Kurt Valentine, argued against placing Alyssa Bustamante in the adult system. He believed that she had the potential for rehabilitation and could be freed once she turned 21. Valentine believed strongly that if she remained in custody with adults, she would either take her own life or be killed while in jail. In his words, he stated that we are throwing away the child and we are signing a death sentence for Alyssa. But the judge stated that her crimes proved that the state did not have adequate services nor a facility to house her as a juvenile. Specifically, Missouri did not have a secure facility with fences for female juveniles, and within the juvenile system, they are typically housed together in groups and are not overseen and watched by staff 24 hours a day. Alyssa Bustamante was transferred to Hawthorne Children's Psychiatric Hospital for evaluation, and then was later sent to Fulton State Hospital under a judge's order. On January 10, 2012, only a few weeks before her murder trial, Alyssa Bustamante, in a plea agreement with the state, appeared in front of the circuit court, pleading guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. According to her defense counsel, she was prepared today to take responsibility for these offenses. At this hearing, the court informed her of the range of penalties she faced if she pled guilty, and that in lieu of a criminal trial, a sentencing hearing would be held where evidence would be presented, and then the judge would determine her punishment. This is equating to her entering what is referred to as a blind plea, where the judge is not bound to agree to any length or condition of the sentence given. Further, that once she pleads guilty, there are no circumstances in which she can withdraw the plea. Alyssa Bustamante entered a plea of guilty knowingly, willingly, voluntarily, and intelligently of the circumstances and the condition set around the agreement. Since she pled guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action, Alyssa Bustamante avoided a criminal trial. Over 2 9-hour days, which must have been excruciatingly painful and felt like forever to Elizabeth Olten's loved ones, Alyssa Bustamante would at last face her fate. Family members, medical personnel, and investigators piled into a small courtroom in Cole County, Missouri to give their testimony. The appearance and energy of the courtroom was a dichotomy. On the defendant's side stood Alyssa Bustamante, with her bangs hanging in her eyes, expressionless, barely muttering a word. Her grandparents, her absentee mother, who showed up finally for her daughter at a murder hearing, and her father, a convicted felon, shackled and in handcuffs. And on the other side sat Elizabeth's mother, her grandmother, and a large group of community friends, many adorned in pink, Elizabeth's favorite color. Elizabeth was buried in pink and her tiny coffin carried by a horse-drawn carriage. The judge first heard from Patty Priest, Elizabeth Olten's mother, who recounted the day her daughter was last seen. Everything was normal. That is until Emma Bustamante showed up out of nowhere, asking her daughter Elizabeth to play outside with her. That made her daughter so happy, so she just said, "Make sure you return by 6 for dinner." That was at 5 p.m. and was the last time she ever saw her 9-year-old daughter alive. Patty Priest went on to share how Elizabeth was beyond special to her. She was her miracle child and her youngest. On the same day doctors had told her she had stage 4 cervical cancer, she found out she was pregnant with Elizabeth. That baby had saved her life. Ms. Priest turned to the judge and said to her, "Elizabeth never gets to get married. She never gets to walk down the aisle. She never gets to go to her first dance, have her first boyfriend. So much has been lost at the hands of this evil monster. If it were up to me, this murderer would never see the light of day again. I will just say that I hate her. I hate everything about her. What I hate most of all is what everyone says about her age. The only thing her age makes is an evil monster." It would be impossible to not agree with this heartbroken mother's words. Next, Anthony Olten, Elizabeth's older brother, took the stand. He was only 13 years old when his little sister was brutally murdered. That day he recalled how he and Elizabeth rode the bus home after school as normal, and then he invited Nathaniel and Joseph, Alyssa's younger twin brothers, to come hang out. When Elizabeth never came home by 6 p.m. as she was supposed to, his mom sent him to go find her, but she was nowhere to be found. Then he remembered how he saw the defendant Alyssa leading her sister Emma up a hill from the woods, saying to her, "Don't tell anyone." Then Emma told him that Elizabeth had already gone back home. That's when Anthony began to become really worried. Elizabeth Olten's sister Stephanie, the oldest child, openly sobbed when she addressed the judge, telling her, "The love that my sister and I shared was so strong that age didn't matter." There was no denying how special Elizabeth was to her family and how deeply she was missed. Detective Sean McDermott next took the stand discussing his interview with Alyssa Bustamante. He recalled how lucid she was, clearly spoken, and not standoffish at all. Tricia Gentry, the FBI agent who discovered the vile and shocking diary inside the bedroom of Alyssa Bustamante, took the stand next. With the information she had collected from her diary, it gave her reason to bring in Alyssa Bustamante for an official interview. The agent noted how the teenager spoke very articulately. She was calm, poised, friendly, even chatty and giggly at times. The 15-year-old swore that she didn't know where Elizabeth was. Agent Gentry observed how she acted perfectly normal and that her answers were quite convincing. A forensic consultant, Don Locke, testified as to the examination of her diary. Through the use of applying different filters and lights, he was able to decipher the message the defendant had attempted to conceal by writing over the last entry in blue ink. The entry said the following, and I quote, I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel ATM or at the moment. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my God, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now. LOL. Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant David Rice provided his testimony regarding his interrogation of the defendant, saying that ultimately she stated she wanted to know what it felt like. How is it that no one in the courtroom or in the media has addressed the fact that this officer literally placed these words in front of her? He fed them to her, to which she said, yeah, I guess so. Not once in the interrogation video does Alyssa Bustamante on her own say this statement. Does this change her guilt? Not at all, but it does paint a less than ethical light upon this investigation when the lead homicide detective gets away with making this false statement, and all forms of media have run with it, making it like Alyssa Bustamante's motto, when it never came from her mouth. Alyssa Bustamante's defense counsel did their best to prove to the judge how broken this girl was, and that there were many mitigating factors to her case. Edwin Johnstone, MD, testified as to how the antidepressant drugs that the defendant was on at the time of the offense undoubtedly played a major contributing role in her crime. Specifically, he told the court how several civil cases, in addition to various studies, showed how antidepressants, including Prozac, which is what Alyssa Bustamante was on at the time, have been proven to cause an increase in violent behavior in some individuals. The data has shown that juvenile girls are the most prone to becoming mentally destabilized by such drugs. Alyssa's age, in combination with her, although undiagnosed, many elements of ADD she exhibited, caused a pre-existing vulnerability in her that led her to react to the drug violently. The doctor testified that the higher dosage could have increased her mood swings and even affected her tendency towards violence. Alyssa's father was present at the hearing, Cesar Bustamante, in chains and handcuffs. He arrived from a Missouri correctional facility to testify to the history of mental illness in his family. He spoke about his own struggle with depression and anxiety and how he had tried to kill himself at 14, when he was only a year older than his daughter's first attempt. Mr. Bustamante also confessed to the extreme abuse of drugs and alcohol by both himself and Alyssa's mother while she was growing up, who even used drugs while she was pregnant with her. According to Karen Brooke, Alyssa's grandmother, who got custody of her when she was 7, Alyssa was a quiet child who cared for her 2 younger brothers and her little half-sister, Emma, as if she were their parent. She was warned by a social services officer that once Alyssa was in a more stable environment, she may behave less mature and act out even more often. But there were no major issues. Alyssa never got in trouble at school, her grades were solid, and things seemed to be fine. That is until 2007, on a trip to the family's lake house, Alyssa tried to kill herself. Brooke discovered the young girl, who was only 13 at the time, lying unresponsive in the shower. There were hundreds of tiny cuts up and down her arms. She got Alyssa some psychiatric help and was placed on Prozac. Things appeared to be getting better for Alyssa, and her sophomore year in high school had been a great year. But then something went terribly wrong, and no one in her life saw the downward spiral she was on until it was far too late. The prosecution presented their own expert testimony regarding her mental state. Anthony Rothschild, professor of psychiatry at University of Massachusetts, stated to the court that he agreed that Alyssa Bustamante suffered from manic depression and bipolar disorder. He, however, believed that it couldn't be denied that she knew right from wrong, and that Prozac or any other antidepressant does not trigger someone to commit homicide. He recalled the interview officer David Rice held with Alyssa Bustamante that he was witness to. Dr. Rothschild claimed that she cooperated with the detective, provided coherent, sensible answers. She was not manic or psychotic and was totally in touch with reality. Alyssa Bustamante had not hidden her cries for help. In August 2007, a fellow student's parents contacted the high school counselor, Lisa Blige, because their daughter was concerned about Alyssa's cutting behavior. The counselor testified to seeing several razor blade cuts in a row on Alyssa's arm. She reached out to Alyssa's grandmother, Karen Brooke, and suggested that she pursue psychiatric services, to which Karen agreed. Alyssa Neitzer, a registered nurse and clinical educator with the University of Missouri, showed the judge a body map she created of Alyssa Bustamante's scars from her admittance up to November 17, 2011. There were pictures of her well over 300 self-made scars, including those inflicted by cigarette butts. One picture showed how Alyssa had scars in the shape of a peace sign inside her hand, which she had created using a staple. Ron Wilson, who was the Children's Services Supervisor at Pathways Mental Health Care, where Alyssa was treated, told the judge that Alyssa's therapists were constantly changing, which was very damaging to any progress made. He worked directly with her, and after her suicide attempt, their treatment plan had changed. She had been diagnosed with major depressive disorder and PTSD, so her therapy was now focused on trauma-focused cognitive behavior. When Alyssa Bustamante was arrested for murder, he visited her and reminded her that she was not alone, telling her to, above all, to hang on to the fact that God loves her, no matter what. Rosalind Schultz, a psychologist, established a timeline of significant events on the defendant on December 7, 2011. She concluded that although she cannot officially diagnose her with borderline personality disorder based on her age, Alyssa Bustamante exhibited many of its known symptoms, including poor impulse control, feelings of emptiness, unstable mood, and inappropriate displays of emotion. The psychologist concluded that she suffered from major depressive disorder that was chronic and current. Her evaluation led her to believe that Alyssa was severely and functionally immature and that serious emotional disturbances in her life played a role in her committing the murder. It was, in her professional opinion, that several life events caused Alyssa Bustamante to be severely impaired in how she coped. The young girl had been faced with her mother's sexual promiscuity, her abandonment, her father in prison, being exposed to domestic violence, and all-around absence and neglect. In Alyssa Bustamante's words, she felt no pain when she cut herself. To Dr. Schultz, this was a sign of dissociation. When Alyssa attempted suicide, it was not just a cry for help. It was her intent to die. None of these mitigating factors would help the defendant. Nothing that was expressed or testified to by the defense could prevent Alyssa Bustamante's grim outcome. There were no words, no diagnosis, no history of self-harm that could wipe away what she had done. She had brutally murdered a 9-year-old child and then expressed elation and excitement after killing her. No one and nothing could change that fact. Alyssa Bustamante had been charged as an adult and would face the harshest possible penalty for her crimes. After Alyssa Bustamante's horrific crimes were painted in explicit detail in the courtroom, her grandparents stormed out. This was the first time Alyssa Bustamante was witnessed crying in silence over 2 years of legal proceedings. Before she was granted her punishment, she spoke the following statement to Elizabeth's family. I cannot even understand what you guys are going through. I'm sorry for that. If I could give my life back to bring her back, I would. And I'm sorry. However, Elizabeth's family didn't buy her apology. They don't believe she is capable of feeling sorry. On February 8, 2012, Judge Patricia Joyce sentenced the now 18-year-old girl to life in prison with the possibility of parole for second-degree murder. Sentencing guidelines vary from state to state in addition to federal sentencing. In the state of Missouri, this sentence equated to 30 years, in addition to 30 years for armed criminal action, to be served consecutively. Alyssa Bustamante was sent to a high-security women's correctional facility in Vandalia, Missouri. In order to be eligible for parole, she must serve 85% of the life sentence and a minimum of 3 years for the armed criminal action conviction. When Alyssa Bustamante was sentenced, Elizabeth Olten's grandmother, Sandy Korn, who was in a wheelchair, cried out, "I think Alyssa should get out of jail the same day Elizabeth gets out of the grave." Alyssa's attorney, Charlie Moreland, made this statement to the press, and I quote, "This was a child who had been spiraling out of control, but has treatable conditions." State prosecutor Mark Richardson felt that her life sentence was completely justified, describing Alyssa as and I quote, "a truly evil individual who strangled and stabbed an innocent child simply for the thrill of it." In addition to her penal sentence, Alyssa Bustamante was ordered to pay restitution to Elizabeth Olten's mother in the amount of $5 million plus 9% interest until paid in full. As I have mentioned in previous episodes, restitution is more than anything a symbolic gesture. The high majority of offenders never fulfill paying this debt. To be fair, the vast majority of us would never be able to pay this off. With the convicted making measly wages in prison for the work they do get, no one would ever be able to pay their restitution. Elizabeth Olten's mother's fury and hatred for Alyssa Bustamante did not stop at her. She believed that the healthcare institution who treated her was to blame and filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Pathways Behavioral Healthcare, 2 of its employees, and Alyssa Bustamante in October 2012. One of the defendants, Ron Wilson, a counselor at Pathways, testified during Alyssa's sentencing hearing that there was never any indication that she was a threat to anyone other than herself. Patricia Priest claims that the clinic had the power to prevent Alyssa's violent tendencies, and there was evidence that was ignored by her psychiatrist. Her lawsuit included how they had failed to detain this violent teenager. They never warned her or anyone else of the specific threats Alyssa Bustamante had alluded to, including harming Elizabeth Olten. She had also filed a separate wrongful death lawsuit against her grandparents, who were Alyssa Bustamante's guardians at the time. During an October 3rd hearing that year, St. Louis County Circuit Judge Gloria Reno ordered them to pay $400,000. While Alyssa Bustamante's case was being heard and her outcome determined in circuit court, a landmark case was underway in the Supreme Court. Miller v. Alabama was pending, a decision. For those of you not familiar with this case and subsequent major change in legislation, the case centered around whether or not it was a violation of the Constitution to impose mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for a juvenile convicted of first-degree murder. In June of the same year that Alyssa Bustamante was sentenced, the Supreme Court confirmed that this statute was a violation of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Alyssa Bustamante filed a timely pro se motion for post-conviction relief, which means she represented herself without a lawyer in the effort to be released based on legal errors. This is different from a traditional appeal, which focuses on legal errors that occurred during the trial. The circuit court denied this motion set forth by Alyssa Bustamante and her plea attorneys. She then appealed. She first contested that she was denied effective assistance to counsel when they failed to thoroughly advise and ensure that she understood the outcome of the pending case Miller v. Alabama and how that decision may affect her. Alyssa Bustamante claimed that if she had been informed there was the possibility that she would not face a mandatory life sentence without parole, she would have proceeded with her initial plea of not guilty and taken her chances at trial. She claimed that her attorney advised and pressured her into pleading guilty, and thus it was an involuntary plea. It is next to impossible to win an appellate case based on ineffective assistance of counsel. In order for this claim to be successful, the appellant must establish 1. That counsel's performance did not conform to the degree of skill, care, and diligence of a reasonably competent attorney, and 2. That she was thereby prejudiced. The circuit court rejected her claim, addressing how the records showed that she was fully informed about the pending litigation in the Miller case and how that potentially impacted her own. The court further stated that her testimony to the contrary was not credible and that the evidence the state had against her would not have been of any benefit to her if she had gone to trial. To this point, I fully agree that the strong and aggravating evidence the prosecution had, if presented at a trial to a jury, would have convicted her of first-degree murder, not second-degree, and sent her to prison indefinitely. Alyssa Bustamante confirmed that she recalled discussing these issues and their potential outcomes of the pending Supreme Court case with her attorneys, but she didn't fully understand them. Not only is the law complex and sounds convoluted to most people, but she was also being impaired by psychiatric medication at this time. She was drowsy and not fully coherent during these discussions, and she was not given ample amount of time to consider her options. Alyssa Bustamante claimed that she only accepted the plea agreement because she believed it was her only option to avoid a life sentence without parole. If the Supreme Court had prohibited life sentences without the possibility of parole for juvenile murders, she may have had a point, but that is not what the Miller case established. On the surface, it appears as if the law made it unconstitutional to prevent a juvenile murderer the possibility of parole, but that is not what the law entails. What it did was change the sentencing guidelines that mandate such a sentence. Having a mandatory sentence for a juvenile convicted of first-degree murder was found to be unconstitutional. Miller v. Alabama held that the sentence upholds the Constitution so long as it is deemed just and appropriate in terms of age, maturity, and other factors presented in the case. That doesn't mean that a judge can't sentence a juvenile to that punishment. And there are many juvenile murderers who still receive life without the possibility of parole. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled under the case Montgomery v. Louisiana that the decision made under Miller should be applied retroactively. This meant that all juveniles sentenced before Miller who had been convicted of first-degree murder and were given life sentences without the possibility of parole were now eligible for resentencing and therefore parole. In 2021, this law was made even nearer, limiting the powers of the judiciary's discretion. Specifically, under Jones v. Mississippi, the court established that although it is not required for a judge to find the offender to be permanently incorrigible to impose a life sentence, as long as they have discretion in each case. The term permanent incorrigibility simply means that a juvenile is beyond rehabilitation. This law exists to encourage judges to look at the unique elements of the offender and the case, which is ideal in any criminal case. This expansion of the legislation set by Miller had the potential to significantly impact Alyssa Bustamante and her future. This horrific murder would lead to major changes in Missouri's legislation. In 2021, Senate Bill 26 was passed. This act provided that any offender under 18 years old at the time of the offense who was sentenced to a term of imprisonment, 15 years or longer, or multiple terms that equated to such, would be eligible for parole, regardless whether the case was finalized for appeal. Elizabeth Olten's mother and loved ones were appalled to think that her killer could be free in only 3 years' time. They petitioned against the act vigorously. However, after this atrocious crime was committed by a youth, legislators sought to change this chance at freedom. In 2021, Missouri state legislation was established that excluded juveniles convicted of first-degree murder to be given the chance of parole. Missouri Governor Mike Parson signed new legislation that amended state laws regarding juvenile murders. Then in 2024, under the strong advocacy of Elizabeth Olten's family, this law now included juveniles who were convicted of second-degree murder. In 2024, Alyssa Bustamante faced her first parole hearing. The specifics behind the hearing are unknown, but to many people's relief, the parole board denied her chance at freedom. Alyssa Bustamante currently resides at the Chillicothe Correctional Center for Women in Chillicothe, Missouri. This concludes the first part of Two Graves and a Diary. Next episode, I will cover the rare kind of violent offender Alyssa Bustamante was, the unique typology of her crime, and the many signs of her pending doom. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to be your host. I wanted to mention that I was recently selected as a hidden gem in the newsletter podcast.today. I am so grateful for having been discovered by the company and that I was chosen to be featured. It is a daily newsletter that features unique, compelling, and often lesser-known podcasts. I know that as a true crime podcast listener myself, I am always on the lookout for something interesting and engaging, especially beyond the norm. Check out their newsletter at podcast.today and sign up to discover unique content like mine. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about this case or ideas for future episodes, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out. You can find my contact information in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.